What happened in Brussels wasn't just a failed meeting. It was the moment a system convinced of its own power ran headfirst into reality and blinked. 16 hours of closed-door negotiations ended in a way almost no one inside the building expected. The European Union did not manage to take control of the frozen Russian assets. The entire strategy unraveled. We'll get to the decision itself shortly, but first it's necessary to understand the scale of the setback European leaders experienced over the course of this day. Everything had been prepared for a victory announcement. Kyiv had been promised 140 billion euros supposedly drawn from Russian funds. Zelensky arrived in Brussels personally, expecting to witness a turning point. From their perspective, every approval had been secured. The outcome seemed predetermined, and yet the ending went in a completely different direction. One prime minister refused to move. Belgium's leader stood alone against institutional pressure, against threats, incentives, and carefully worded ultimatums. One man facing the full machinery of the European Union. He said no and did not reverse course. Was it surprising? Absolutely. But this refusal was only the opening chapter of a much larger sequence that played out beyond public view. Look closely at how the summit began. The first day was marked by total confidence. Ursula von der Leyen spoke sharply and directly. No one, she said, would leave until the matter was resolved. NATO Secretary General echoed support. The pressure intensified. By the hour, observers assumed the Belgian Prime Minister would crack quickly, maybe within 90 minutes, 2 hours at most. Then the funds would be released and the West would showcase another display of unity that never happened. The reason matters. This was not stubbornness for its own sake. The Belgian Prime Minister was unwilling to saddle his country's taxpayers with an obligation that would never be repaid. While others avoided the obvious, he confronted it. Ukraine was not going to return this money, not now, not later, not under any future scenario. Someone would eventually pay the price. The only uncertainty was who. By evening, the mood inside the summit shifted. Ukraine slipped down the priority list. Conversations moved into side rooms. Officials began talking about delays, about reconsideration, about finding ways to change one person's position. The effort became frantic. Pressure escalated, warnings were issued, compensation was offered, career implications were hinted at. Nothing changed his answer. And then came the pivot. After 16 exhausting hours, NATO Secretary General stepped forward with an entirely different announcement. 90 billion euros would be allocated, not by confiscating Russian assets, but through a collective European loan. A standard loan backed by the EU budget, which Ukraine would supposedly repay after victory and future reparations from Russia. In other words, repayment would never happen. Was this a win for Kyiv? On paper, perhaps. Funds were approved. Zelensky could speak publicly about unwavering Western support, about solidarity in a critical moment, about resources continuing to flow. The headlines would sound reassuring. The statements would be polished. But beneath the surface, this outcome was disastrous for everyone involved. Zelensky had come to Brussels with a singular mission. He met leaders, projected certainty, and spoke as if the result was already secured. He believed his presence would tip the balance. Instead, the Belgian Prime Minister did not yield, even to him. Zelensky departed early, heading to Poland, leaving European officials to manage the aftermath alone. Before leaving, he delivered confident remarks about his negotiating strength, about being underestimated, about moral clarity and fairness. At the time, the words sounded firm. Now they resemble self-deception. No one forced Europe into this position. European leaders did it themselves. They had promised confiscation. They claimed Russia would be compelled into negotiations once assets were transferred. Expectations were inflated. Inevitability was manufactured. And then reality intervened. Putin later addressed the press calmly. There was no visible concern. The assets remained untouched. Yes, they were frozen, but frozen assets are reversible. Confiscated assets are not. The distinction is fundamental, and it changed everything. The EU leadership miscalculated badly. They issued threats, imposed deadlines, and applied relentless pressure. They forced negotiations forward without acknowledging obvious risks. The objective itself was flawed. Confiscation would not have transformed Ukraine's military position, economy, society. Its primary effect would have been redistributing funds through political and bureaucratic channels. That pattern is familiar. Money is allocated, portions disappear, transparency fades, accountability never arrives. Yet European leaders faced another problem. They had to explain to their citizens why national budgets would now shoulder the burden, why taxpayers would service debt Ukraine could not repay. They offered no explanation at all. European media largely fell silent, no justification, no debate, just forward motion. Friedrich Merz became an unintended symbol of the moment. He warned that failure would inflict long-term damage on European credibility, unity and decision-making. The damage arrived exactly as described, a direct hit, predictable, painful, except Merz believed fear would motivate consensus. Instead, it exposed fragility. For weeks, officials had insisted the decision was settled. Hungary, they sigh. Would not obstruct the process. Brussels had leverage. Pressure tools existed. Even intelligence services were invoked in whispers. None of it mattered. That reality revealed far more than the outcome itself. Merz now threatens Moscow rhetorically, promising that frozen assets remain inaccessible until reparations are paid, and that funds will eventually cover European liabilities in accordance with international law. If such legal clarity existed, the humiliation in Brussels would never have occurred. Confiscation would have proceeded cleanly, without spectacle or failure. Merz also lost on another front. He expected approval of the Mercosur trade agreement, the same deal that had sparked farmer protests across Brussels. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, secured at least a month's delay. While opposing confiscation, she navigated competing interests skillfully, offering symbolic support to Zelensky and protecting Italian agriculture from collapse. Then there is Viktor Orban. Hungary refused entirely. It declined participation in the joint loan. Hungarian authorities rejected transferring the burden onto their taxpayers. Orban demonstrated that resistance was possible and effective. Brussels pressure had limits. Slovakia and the Czech Republic followed. Both governments opted out. They declined to burden their citizens for a strategy that extended suffering and sustained corruption. Observing Hungary, they recognized that refusal carried no catastrophic consequences. 90 billion euros spread over 2 years changes nothing for Ukraine. Next year's projected deficit alone approaches 71 billion. Total financial requirements exceed 130 billion. Meanwhile, foreign assistance is declining. Kyiv will return to international laws repeatedly. European leaders insist the confiscation issue remains alive. They describe the pause as temporary, but psychologically and politically the moment has passed. Weakness was exposed, division became visible, resolve dissolved under pressure. Another detail matters. This was not a grant, it was debt. Debt carries servicing costs, legal complications, political risk. What happens if additional countries withdraw? What if participation erodes further? It is remarkable to see struggling economies enter this arrangement. Baltic states speak emotionally of contributions, offering symbolic amounts. Their history explains the emotion, but not the decision. In the end, debt does not disappear. Ukrainians will pay directly or indirectly. Future generations will service obligations created today. The burden will persist for decades. It will not vanish with leadership changes. Even wealthier EU nations face constraints, growth slows, inflation persists, social programs shrink. Asking taxpayers to absorb Ukrainian liabilities invites backlash. When new political forces emerge, they will demand repayment. During a public address, Putin warned clearly. Expropriation would erode trust in the Eurozone. Any seized assets would eventually have to be returned. The international financial system does not forgive such precedents. A Ukrainian delegation is expected in Miami soon, signaling a shift in negotiation venues and actors. Europe has demonstrated its limits. Putin's press conference reflected this. Questions ranged from trivial to substantive. Economic concerns were addressed openly. There was no visible strain. His confidence was unshaken. Frozen assets remained frozen. Confiscation would have triggered a fundamentally different response. Russia would have reacted forcefully. That scenario never materialized. the EU absorbed a painful lesson. 16 hours of pressure yielded nothing. The confiscation strategy collapsed. Loan obligations replaced it. Who benefited? Zelensky obtained funds that do not resolve structural problems. Europe exposed internal fractures. Moscow gained confirmation that Western systems falter under strain. Most importantly, this story is not finished. The issue will resurface repeatedly at every summit, in every budget debate, with every request from Kyiv. The Belgian Prime Minister showed that one refusal can halt momentum. Orbán showed defiance works. Slovakia and the Czech Republic defended domestic interests. Meloni balanced symbolism and substance. And the European Union revealed vulnerability. 16 hours ended not in resolution, but in exposure. Strength proved performative. Unity proved conditional. Resolve evaporated. This may be called a pause. It is not, it is a turning point. Western leaders sought to demonstrate power. They failed. And that failure will echo. The assets remain frozen, not seized. And that distinction defines everything that follows.